So in the previous problem, we were looking at factoring polynomials completely, and we actually solved that polynomial after factoring it. This one we're not going to solve, we'll just factor it completely, although if you wanted to solve the polynomial as well as a little extra challenge, I would welcome such an attempt. But we're just going to go ahead and factor this. And whenever we have one of these problems, the first thing we always have to look for is a greatest common factor, aka something which is in all of the terms in our problem that we can pull out. So if we look at this, I'm going to put my parentheses around this because there is stuff that we can factor out using our greatest common factor. The first thing to notice is that we have d to the third power, d to the second, and d. All three of these terms share a d, so we're able to pull one d out outside of our parentheses here. After that, we then need to look at the numbers, the coefficients that are attached to our d to the third, d to the second, and d, and see if they share anything. All three of these numbers, -15, 21, and -6, are divisible by a 3. So I can go ahead and pull a 3 out of there. In addition to that, whenever you are factoring, you always want to make sure that your leading and highest degree portion of the polynomial we're working with has a positive coefficient on it. If you do not pull the negative sign out at the beginning, you will have to pull the negative sign out later in the problem, which can get to be a little bit more complicated. So it's better instead to do it at the beginning. So to that end, since this is a -15d cubed, I am instead going to take out a -3. And this will cause the sign on everything up here to flip when we write it inside of parentheses. So when we take the -3 out of -15, what we're left with is 5, because 5 times -3 is -15. And since we got one d out of d to the third power, we now have d squared. After that, when we divide this 21 by a -3, what we're left with is a -7. Notice once again that -3 times -7 is a positive 21. And there's one d left out of the previous d squared. And finally, -6 divided by -3 is +2. And since there was only one d here to begin with, we do not need to have any more d's here. It's now just a single 2. So from here, we've now managed to factor out -3d. And inside our parentheses here, we now need to factor this. And we need to begin by identifying our a, b, and c, which here are 5. A is the number attached to the squared term. -7. B is the number attached to the, normally just the single x term. In this case, it's a d. And c is the constant added at the end, which is 2. From there, we need to identify a times c, which is equal to 10. And our b is -7. So we need to look for factors of 10, which add up to -7. And there are only 4 factors of 10, which are 1, 10, 2, and 5. And if you think about 2 and 5, 2 plus 5 is equal to 7. So that would mean that -2 minus 5 is equal to -7. So that checks out. And of course, -2 times -5 equals 10. So these are the factors we're looking for. And now we need to go ahead and disassemble our -7d on the inside of our parentheses. So we still have our -3d hanging out on the outside of the parentheses. We still have 5d squared. But now we have a -5d and a -2d plus 2. So the plus 2 is still the same. The only thing that's changed is our -7d has become -5d and -2d. And as we continue to work through this, we must now factor out our stuff using each pair that we have. So we still have our -3d out here. When we look at 5d squared and -5d, we can factor out a 5 and a d. And that leaves us with d and -1. And in case you're not sure if you factored out the right thing, you can always distribute this back through and check. 5d times d is 5d squared. 5d times -1 is -5d. And our second one, this time we need to factor out a -2. So we want to get rid of the entire thing that's attached to our d here. So we take out the -2, and 2 divided by -2 leaves us with a -1. You'll know if you've accidentally, like if you accidentally only factored out a +2 here, you'd be left inside the parentheses with -d and +1. These two things need to match in order to actually do the factoring. So you then want to try and pull out the -2, and you'd end up with these two things factoring, or matching, I mean. Anyway, from here, we just need to pull out our factor of d minus 1. And our -3d is still hanging outside. We now have d minus 1. That was the thing we were able to factor out of these two terms. And then we're left with 5d minus 2. And that is completely factoring this problem. In this problem, we had to do our greatest common factor, and then inside of our parentheses, it was a long, winding road with factoring by grouping to get to our final answer.